Thanks for coming. My name is Ed Friedman. I chair Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. We have a table outside if you didn't see it. I encourage you to stop in there afterwards to look at our literature, make a donation. The series costs us about $800 a year to put on. And we have some drinks and we have some cookies and maybe we'll have some yogurt by the time Gary's done. Maybe there's a UPS man somewhere who's really enjoying it. We had planned on that, and so we apologize if it doesn't come through tonight. And how long is it good for, anyway?
90 days. 7 weeks.
How long?
7 weeks.
7 weeks. So maybe if we can intercept it from the outing club, which is where it was sent, we'll bring it to our next and last event of the season, which will be over at Curtis Memorial Library on May 31st. And that speaker is a gentleman, Dr. Alex Gordoff, who is going to speak on fish-friendly turbines. For those of you that don't know us, we do a lot of work to ensure migratory fish can get safely up and down the rivers in Maine, and really encourage people to think of rivers as our arteries, sort of the same thing. To ensure the health of the Gulf of Maine, to ensure the health of Maine, the interior of Maine, we need those arteries open, or at least not totally occluded. And so this gentleman has done a lot of work. He's going to Europe shortly he's been nominated for Inventor of the Year award. Was a compatriot, literally, of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And he's been in the States for about 35 years. So join Alex Gorloff and us at Curtis with probably some yogurt in a month, if not tonight. But to back up, Friends of Merrymeeting Bay is a unique organization in Maine. We are a land trust. We've protected probably 1,600 acres around the bay, which is just north of here. And Merrymeeting Bay is a unique body of water. It's where 6 rivers come together and meet, the Kennebec and the Androscoggin being the largest. It's fresh water. It's tidal. Drains about 100,000 square miles of Maine. And largest stopover spot north of Chesapeake for migratory waterfowl in the fall. And so we protected a lot of land. We are currently involved in a project that will protect and has already protected. It's been described as the most significant archaeological site in the state of Maine, prehistoric archaeological site. And that's just up the Kennebec River in Dresden. We have a $170,000 loan outstanding for a year to finish the acquisition there. We take big checks as well, stock donations. We work with kids. So we tie all these things together: education, research, advocacy, and land conservation. Reach out to about 1,500 kids a year through various in-school and really get them dirty programs as well. And Tuesday, May 24th is our Spring Bay Day, which will be over at the Chop Point School in Woolwich. And you should come and volunteer as a chaperone maybe, or if you can do a hands-on presentation, that would be cool too. And you could speak to me or Jim Mason, our executive coordinator right back there, or Kathleen McGee sitting next to him, one of our former board members and an active volunteer. It's a really fun day, and it's for no other reason than to come to the Chops and see what is really about 40% of all the water in Maine rushing by in a 280-yard slot through the bedrock is really awesome. So we've done a lot of neat research around circulation study in the bay and the tributaries. As you can imagine, the 6 rivers, it's a very complicated system. Use that information for various advocacy issues. We've done some first group in the state to use caged mussels, caged bivalves, to look at contaminants and find hotspots with those. Look at our website. It's www.friendsofmerrymeetingbay.org. FOMB.org works as well. We are a membership organization. Got about 450 members. We're running a special now for all of you that are into Facebook. If you join us as one of our friends, we'll give you a free 1-year membership. And if you do that, sign up. Jim will get in touch with you and make that happen. So research, land trust, land conservation, education, and advocacy. We've been working through regulatory methods in the state. We've been in state court. We're in federal court now under Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act lawsuits working to protect the fish in the rivers mostly. That's what most of our legal stuff has been around. But we've also done a lot of pollution prevention, toxic waste reduction, and so forth. And I guess as we encourage you to volunteer, again, as sort of a segue into introducing our speaker. Kathleen and I were up at the State House just a couple of days ago. We're trying to upgrade the lower Androscoggin River, and we've had a group of people monitoring water conditions out there for quite a few years. It should be a higher classification than it is. The Androscoggin is sort of the poor stepchild of Maine rivers, but it's really slowly getting better, and we like to recognize that. And we do that because there's anti-degradation language in statute that prohibits backsliding. So once it gets to a certain level, if you can label it and call it that, legally it can't go back down, at least without a lot of hassle. So, but we ran into some of the people on the other side of this issue, and it's really sad, but there's so many people that are still in the payroll versus pickerel paradigm. You know, instead of, you can have eels and electricity, and you can have these things and be sustainable and make money at it. And we speak about economics all the time, and Kathleen is a whiz at that, and then of course Gary is an example of bringing that to the fore. So it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. Gary got his, I don't know about his start, but for many years ago he worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service up down in Moosehorn area in Calais. He spent time at the New Alchemy Institute as executive director, which was a really cool place down in Woods Hole. I was there years ago for a short visit, and I'll always remember it. It's too bad it's not there, but that was one of the early institutions that really spoke to the cyclic methodologies that we have to pursue, and the sustainable methodologies we have to pursue, as Gary just said, the nonlinear approach, which is where we historically have been. He directed the Rural Education Center, a small organic farming school from which Stonyfield was spawned. And then since 1983, Gary's overseen Stonyfield and its tremendous growth. 7-cow organic farm to start, to currently grossing about $360 million in annual sales. Stonyfield's enjoyed compounded annual growth rate of over 24% for more than 18 years. We need to get you to the State House, Gary, talk to some of these people. So they think Clean River and they're going to go out of business, you know. So yeah, anyway, Stonyfield, as most of you know, blending good tasting products with a social understanding, doing social good, innovative marketing, being concerned with environmental and you know, blending environmental, social, and financial all together, and making a profit at it. Stonyfield is now in a partnership with Groupe Danone. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but essentially it's Danone yogurt, which is the yogurt I grew up with. And Gary is now managing director of Stonyfield Europe, a joint venture with a couple of brands, Danone and Stonyfield, in Canada, Ireland, and France. He's on several corporate boards and nonprofit boards, probably about 8 of them at least here. I won't read them, but he's received 8 honorary doctorates, which is kind of neat. Congratulations. You know? Won numerous awards for corporate and environmental leadership, including Global Green USA's 1999 Green Cross Millennium Award for Corporate Environmental Leadership, and was named a Gordon Grand Fellow at Yale. 2009, Gary was named as one of America's most promising social entrepreneurs by Business Week. Stonyfield was chosen Business of the Year for Manufacturing by Business New Hampshire magazine, and Stonyfield won an EPA Clean Air Excellence Award. Gary also featured in 2009's successful documentary Food Inc., and in 2010, Stonyfield was honored as Business of the Decade, Manufacturing Technology by Business New Hampshire magazine. You need a wall for all this stuff, right? So congratulations again. I want to thank Bowdoin before I turn the podium over. Thank Bowdoin for letting us be here and co-sponsoring this with us. Patagonia for sponsoring our series for many, many years. We usually do a pass the basket thing and you know, win a door prize, something from Patagonia. Because of the space here, we're not doing that tonight. but your chances will be double if you come May 31st. May 31st, yeah. You didn't bring any of your books, did you, by any chance? Okay. So Gary's also the author of Storing It Up, How to Make Money and Save the World. And with that, I welcome you. And thank you.
Well, thank you. The intro may be longer than the speech, so it's always fun for me to be here. Partly because I've got a child here, at least for a couple more weeks, and one at Bates as well, and also a restaurant down the road. I hope you all know what used to be Au Naturals, the Stonyfield Cafe in Falmouth. So I always love the excuse. I'm on our birthday tour. Stonyfield's 28th birthday was this past Saturday, so yes, don't take that for granted. So anyhow, that was sort of the perfect setup, your visit to the State House, because I'm really here to just shatter that myth. Let's just get that behind us. This idea in 2011 that there's any conflict at all between investing in sustainable practices and having a sound economy is truly just that. It's a myth, which is why I titled this talk this way. It truly is what we're going to talk about tonight is something that's great for business and certainly great for the planet. And obviously this bay north of here is really worth preserving and paying attention to. You know, I often start with this slide because when you look at us in the West, this is a projection by a website called World Mapper. You could go to worldmapper.com and you can see projections where they expand or shrink the size of the girth of countries based on different statistics. So you could look at literacy or diabetes, or this happens to be population, and as you can see, we're pretty skinny over here in the Western Hemisphere. But if you superimpose our greenhouse gas footprint, our climate footprint, by the way, you could superimpose our water footprint or our toxins footprint or any number of other environmental footprints, you see that, in fact, we've got quite a girth relative to our skinnier size. You'll also note that we're only second to China, who only just exceeded us in terms of climate footprint. And so the issue is really that I want to talk about tonight is not just the numbers of us, because that's an issue. 9.2 billion of us are going to be here, it's expected, in the next 40 years. But it's how we live. And when you look at how we live, you realize that virtually every way that we touch the earth we're experiencing positive feedback systems that are showing us that we've basically been on the wrong path. We have to change our approach to relating to this wonderful earth of ours. You could look at lighting, for example, as just one of hundreds of examples, and note that in fact something on the order of 30 to 50% of the energy that we spend to light our buildings and our streets and so forth, actually 30 to 50% goes somewhere else. It doesn't even light the space that you're on, which is to say, you know, it's an enormous amount of waste that, frankly, we've never really measured because it's always been cheap. You know, you just flip the switch and you know, you get a little puff of smoke somewhere away, that mythological place that we'll talk about. But essentially, you know, in America, we waste more energy than we actually use. And we actually waste more energy than Japan uses, and Japan's the third largest GDP on Earth. So, you know, while some of this starts off being a little depressing, I hope what you're going to get right away is that this is a huge opportunity for us. When we talk about, you know, the export, literally, of 50% of our dollars for services that we're not getting back, that's an opportunity from a business point of view to plug the leaks. You could look at water, which is not any different from looking at energy, and recognize water is being talked about as the oil of the 21st century, with a doubling of worldwide water use every 21 years, or a six-fold increase since the beginning of the last century. We now know that water is not a renewable resource. Water is a resource to be preserved and protected. And if you live anywhere close to the southwestern U.S., you know exactly what I'm talking about, because it's now becoming a true limiting factor. In fact, Southern California is in deep trouble as we move rapidly into the 21st, well into the 21st century. We could look at topsoil, which the statistics are that something like 50% of the topsoils that were here when Lewis and Clark made their way across the country are now gone. They are, of course, not gone. They're in the bottoms of oceans somewhere. But we've never really paid attention to our topsoils as a civilization because we've always been able to replace that fertility with something synthesized, with oil from the ground or natural gas-based chemical fertilizers. And if you look at the chart of fertilizer use that we've used to make up for our kind of, our sort of broken relationship here, you see a chart that looks a lot like every other chart of resource consumption since the middle part of the last century. From 1950 to the present, you've had this incredible spiking. And I could show you this with regard to every major mineral. I could show you this with regard to basically everything we derive or get from the earth. And so, these go on and on and on and get folks really depressed, and it's already a gloomy night. So I'm not going to belabor this, other than to tell you that this is all the kind of the background that I had coming into this business world. I never ever thought I'd be in business. As you heard, my background was ecology and climate change. But when I came across the data, for example, supporting this phenomenon, these hypoxias, which this audience probably knows about, most don't. But there's some 200 of these zones around the world. These are dead zones. These are zones where a hypoxic condition means there's an absence of oxygen. And the reason there's an absence of oxygen is the nitrogen fertilizers that we apply to make up for our lack of attention to natural fertility of our soils. When we put in synthetic fertility, a lot of that nitrogen runs off, and like the soil, and it runs into ultimately the Mississippi River, which drains into the Gulf of Mexico. And the net result is that you get these algal blooms, which then die off, and you get a huge depression in dissolved oxygen, such that there's a zone now the size, I say here because I just gave this talk in Canada last week, size of Lake Ontario, but you could think of it as the size of New Jersey and growing by about 20% annually. And Chesapeake Bay is now becoming hypoxic, so is San Francisco Bay, so are the major estuaries of the world. And again, these are just examples we've seen. You all certainly know about climate change. In the 400,000-year history of ice cores, we know that dissolved oxygen, that atmospheric CO2 has oscillated by, within a measurable up and down, a measurable range. But now we're sitting at a place that is completely out of sync with anything that we've ever seen before in the 400,000-year record of ice cores. I'm wondering if you all can even see any of this, and you shouldn't worry about insulting me if you need to walk across. I don't know if the podium's blocking you, but okay. If you fall asleep, I'll wake you up. But in any case, on a business as usual basis, if we continue to burn fossil fuels the way we are now, we're going to a place that we've certainly never been even conceived of in the longest record we have of atmospheric CO2. And in fact, interestingly, if we implemented a national clean energy and efficiency program, we would still be warming the planet for another 40 years. If we stopped all fossil fuel burning tonight, we would warm the planet for another 40 or 50 years. So this idea that we can slow it down, or we can, address these problems through efficiency or reductions, these are all important steps, but we cannot reverse this trend that way. We've got to reverse with an entirely different way of thinking. And I don't probably have to explain to this audience the impacts of climate change that we're going to be experiencing. It's very widely understood, even by climate deniers, that Katrina was a climate event. And certainly hotter hots, colder colds, more heat in the atmosphere, and so forth are a problem. The reality, though, is that all of this discussion about the environment translates to how we treat our bodies as well. This same sort of flawed mythological approach that we can just heap abuse out there. So, if you may be aware that now 2/3 of Americans are overweight or obese. In fact, the percentage of Americans who are obese actually exceeds now the percentage who are overweight. Obesity is 20% above being overweight for your height. But leaving aside the moral and ethical aspects of this, which are of course drastic, you can just look at the financial realities of this and realize that $150 billion cost, and this is a trend line, to deal with obesity-related disease. By the way, the CDC just came out with the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, so that diabetes is now costing us $157 billion. 1 in 3 children born after the year 2000 is going to be a type 2 diabetic. So again, I know this is all very depressing. I promise you I'll end the pain momentarily. But you can translate from all of these data about obesity and diabetes, which are absolutely preventable diseases that are a direct result of our sedentary lifestyles and the amount of carbohydrates we're eating and all the bad yogurt we're eating and all of that. But you also have to, you can't, and Michelle Obama is to be commended for her incredible work in focusing the nation on obesity and diabetes. But unless you're looking at toxins, we're not even beginning to deal with the most serious health crises we're facing, because now the President's Cancer Panel tells us that 41% of us are going to have cancers. We're talking about, you take the $150 billion for obesity or 150 or so for diabetes, multiply that by 4 or 5 to get to the costs of treating a country where 41%, almost half of us, have one cancer or another. How many of you know somebody with cancer? Just, you see? I mean, this is an epidemic. Every single person here practically raised their hand. So this, when we're trying to understand the causes, you don't have to go very far. This study sort of says it all. This was a study in 2 independent laboratories in different parts of the country looking at babies at the moment of birth, looking for 413 chemicals at the moment of birth and finding 287 of them, half of which are known carcinogens. And they're not necessarily at carcinogenic levels at the moment of birth, but they're present. And the synergistic effects, the compounded effects of these chemicals have never ever been understood. In fact, the health level, the safety levels for children have never been understood. We set our safety levels based on adult dosages. So, and if you don't have to look far to understand. Again, many of these chemicals are not food-based. A lot of them are lead paint or heavy metals. But when one looks at food, you see that there's a pretty serious problem. So if you had a non-organic banana for breakfast this morning, just close your eyes for just a second, because this is actually what these compounds are present in every non-organic banana that's out there. You can titrate for this stuff at various levels. And this idea that it's in, bless you, this idea that this is in the skin of the banana is a joke, or any other fruit. It's throughout the tissue, because this stuff is in solution, and osmotically it moves right through the apple or the pear or the banana or what have you. And so when we see trends like this, and I just mentioned the President's Cancer Panel, it becomes no wonder. And again, this chart started in 1940, and you can see the skyrocketing. Or you look at childhood cancers. People say, well, we're getting sicker because we're living longer. Not true. We see these rates even with children. And so, enough of the pain. Let me just sort of summarize and tell you why I tied all of that together. From my vantage point, we've had these modern day, what I call myths, underlying our approach to economics, our approach to business, our approach to life. One of them is, nobody will ever say these words, but we actually act as if the earth is a subsidiary of our economies, that it's there for the taking and there for the dumping. We have a myth that the earth is infinitely resilient and productive to meet our needs, that it will take whatever abuse we can keep heaping on it. And we now are starting to see, like I said earlier, the feedback systems that says that isn't so. But ultimately, the ultimate sort of, I think, umbrella myth is this one. We've allowed in the basic design of our modern economics, this concept of externalities, this idea that there can be direct consequences to how we behave, direct results of our businesses, pollution, national diabetes or obesity trend, climate change, that don't appear on our income statement or our balance sheet. These are real costs, real results of our businesses, but nobody accounts for them, and therefore no one's accountable for them. No one's responsible for climate change. No one's responsible for toxifying our planet. No one's responsible for 41% of us getting cancer. And until we recognize that central flaw, that idea that we can allow these externalities to happen and not account for them, until we really get there, we're not going to get anywhere. And what I want to persuade you tonight is that, I've got a company that we pollute. We're not flawless. All businesses do, all humans do. But we have been able to internalize the externalities. We've been able to focus on the net consequences. And as I'm going to show you in just a moment, we've turned that into some real profitability. Now, I was studying this stuff back in the early 70s. A wonderful study by a couple of scientist friends of mine. And the model has been replicated in '04. And without getting your eyes twisted at this late hour by this chart, basically what they were showing is if we projected forward the use of resources, the industrial output, food production, the population growth, just the trends and the pollution that results from the 20th century, if we just forecasted forward with more people growing and more Western habits being adopted in China and India and so forth, we would reach basically a peaking out of the productivity of the Earth's ability to support us by about the middle of the 21st century, by about 2050, and then a rather precipitous decline in the Earth's ability to support us, with only one line continuing to go up, and that's pollution. Now, I was studying this stuff back here, in the mid-1970s, thinking, okay, 2050 is a long way from from where I was, but of course now it's here. It's certainly here for the students who are here, and if you all eat enough organic yogurt, you may see it too. But either way, it's not a trend. These are not trends that we can ignore, nor are they theoretical anymore. If anything, these trends are happening faster because there's synergistic impacts. So this is Stonyfield Farm, where the young man in the back was born. This is Stonyfield 1983. This was a couple of questions that we asked ourselves. Is it possible to actually create business that addresses, that tries to address these issues instead of just accepting, we're just going to, burn out the Earth's ability to support us. And as was mentioned in the introduction, we've had a wonderful growth rate for many, many years. We obviously are doing something right, business-like. But I want to make the case here that we're also doing quite a lot right that should be a stimulating hope about a different way to operate business. This is a look at Stonyfield today, that we've outgrown that farm and the 7 cows. We now support 1,850 family farmers around the country with an average herd size of 72 cows. So somebody smarter than me can do the math, but it's a lot of cows, a lot more than 7. When you are looking at this whole notion of sustainability, you have to kind of see it conceptually. And conceptually, the first step is, let's say we're trying to turn this building, make this building more sustainable. Well, the first is to make it compliant with EPA regs. That's really not a great leap. You don't want to be fined, you don't want to be sued, you have to be compliant. That's kind of step 1. Step 2 would be that we would focus on the energy use in the building. There's probably a boiler here somewhere that's generating heat or cools the building in the summer. We have waste that we generate, water usage and so forth. And so you try to sort of focus on those requirements. And then the step 3 would be the supply chain. That, of course, includes the electricity, the power that's coming in from somewhere. But also the carpeting, the chairs, the lighting fixtures, the building itself, the wood on the stage, the materials here. And those are really, the supply chain for all of our businesses is actually where the biggest part of our footprint is. Even Stonyfield, which is now quite a large manufacturing facility, the lion's share of our footprint, even though we burn a lot of electricity on our facility, and much of it is renewable, but the lion's share is what I bring in, is the fruit, the milk, the cups, and so forth, as I'll get to. But ultimately, we need to get to another place, because as I've already mentioned, this idea that we're going to just plug leaks, focusing here on steps 2 and 3, this is critical work. There's a lot of dollars to be mined. There's a lot of savings to be gotten through conservation and reductions of these footprints. But ultimately, the place we need to get to is step 4, and I'll get there in just a second. This is a picture of Stonyfield's greenhouse gas inventory. I won't belabor the details. What it does is it measures every aspect of our business, our packaging that comes in, our commuter miles, the yogurt that we ship, the trucking, the manufacturing plant. And when you take, for example, and look at just the transportation section, for example, we literally know the carbon footprint for every cup of yogurt or truckload that's going to Florida or Texas or Maine or whatever. And what we've done is we've taken that map and we've turned it into literally something we call the MAP program, which is our mission action program, where we've taken our 9 largest footprints and created cross-functional teams. These are teams made up of people in marketing, people in sales, people in HR, accounting, engineering, manufacturing, logistics. And so every one of these teams might have 4 people to 16 people. And they go from the largest footprint, which is our milk greenhouse gas emissions, that's really the cows, to our 9th largest, which is what we call SWAT, that's Stonyfielders walking our talk. That's the food that comes into the plant and the commuting miles. And these folks have been empowered to attack and reduce, like I said earlier, to look at their externalities, to look at the costs, the inefficiencies, and try to reduce them. And just to cut to the punchline, those 9 teams have saved our company since 2006 $18.2 million. So over $18 million have actually gone directly in to our bottom line as a result of investing in these kinds of reductions. So when I say that we're not going to solve the Earth's problems with steps 2 and 3 on that earlier slide, there's a lot of money to be gotten. No business can afford to ignore numbers like this. And it isn't my purpose tonight to go into all the details. These give you some examples of the kinds of things we've done. I promise you there's hundreds of examples that add up to these kinds of reductions. And the reality is that the numbers are going up on an annual basis. Not only as we grow are the numbers getting bigger, but as we get better and better at getting reductions, each year we're increasing more and more. Last year alone was a $7.5 million year of direct savings to our bottom line. In Stonyfield's terms, that's something like 63 jobs, by the way. I mean, it's really been our job creator. So getting back to this chart, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's not. I don't want to minimize for a second the idea of reducing impacts on transportation or water use or any of these. But I do want to focus your attention here, because ultimately this is where, as Sherlock Holmes would say, the game is afoot. Sustainability is really not efficiency. We're talking about something quite different. We're talking about a way of innovating, a way of thinking that has not been common in the 20th century, in an era when there was always more land to be had, there was always more oil to be drilled, there were always more minerals to be gotten. Well, we're hitting the limits of all of the above. So it really means that we have to change how we think. And I've shown this slide here before, so forgive me if you've seen it before, but it illustrates beautifully this idea of thinking differently. If I asked you how much water was in this cup of latte that you might have had today, and I realize college students would probably give a different number, much larger, a lot of caffeine consumed here, than the rest of us do. But nevertheless, let's call it 14, 16 ounces. Let's call it, a pint or a liter of water, something, or a half a liter of water, let's say. In fact, the amount of water needed to produce one single cup of coffee is more like this. It's 208 liters or quarts of water. And that's because by the time you add up the water needed to grow the coffee, to grow the grain that's needed to feed the cows, the water that's needed to feed the cows, the water that's needed to wash the dairy and all of that, etc., the industrial uses of water needed for the stuff on the left, it's a lot of water. And that is to say that there's a giant footprint behind everything that we do. Every one of us has a much bigger footprint, particularly those of us in the West. And by the way, this is not just a water footprint. Every one of us has a big toxins footprint. Every one of us has a big carbon footprint. And so it's only when we take a life cycle, when we think differently, we recognize the all-in costs. I often say, for me, we're very proud of our recycling efforts at Stonyfield. We've saved enormous amounts of money. But recycling is really the failure to reduce or reuse. In fact, there's a carbon footprint to recycling. There's a lot of energy needed to gather, shred, melt, reform that packaging. In fact, net, recycling is not carbon positive. Ultimately, success for me is using less. Ultimate success is when you finish eating the yogurt, you'll eat the cup. And that may seem silly, but that's actually the way, I promise you, especially the students here, this is the way it's going to be in your lives. We are not, another of these myths is this idea of waste, that we're allowed produce something called waste. It doesn't happen in nature. We're the only species who's given ourselves this license. And then we have this mythological place called away, where we send the waste. I've yet to figure out where that is. But I'll mention it in the context of this slide, because we've taken this very seriously. As ecologists, as folks with a background in ecology and climate, we've looked at every aspect of our company. I'm just going to give a couple of examples of what I call this fourth stage thinking. This is a wonderful one. We exceeded the capacity of our local wastewater treatment plant. We wash our tanks every 24 hours by law, and so we end up this yogurt residue, this fruit residue, it goes out. And the net result of it is that we produce a lot of BOD, a lot of biological waste. And when I went to the local authorities and asked them what I should do about it, they said, well, you have to build a traditional wastewater treatment plant, which is an aerobic facility, where basically, we employ this myth that the solution to pollution is dilution. What that means is that we take our waste, we add it to water, we oxygenate it, we agitate it, we add some chemicals, and then we send the water back to a river, hopefully clean, and we are left with something called sludge, which is this externality, this waste product. And I discovered that it was going to be we were going to generate 1 truckload of sludge every single week if we built one of these facilities. And obviously, actually, I went to the local authorities. They said, well, what do I do with the sludge, there in New Hampshire? And they said, well, it's really easy. You send it to Vermont. That was their idea of a way. And, I'm sitting there picturing Ben and Jerry's, sending it back to New Hampshire and thinking there's got to be another way. So we built an anaerobic facility, a facility that breaks down this waste in the absence of oxygen. And the net result of anaerobic digestion is that you generate a useful gas, of which methane is a component, and methane is a very burnable gas, this biogas, which runs the system. And so the net result is you can see the statistics, I don't have to read them to you, but this has been ecologically a complete home run for us. We produce almost no sludge. The only sludge we produced in the 5 years has been because of a couple of mistakes we made in calibrating the loading of the system. We had basically too much acid, not enough base in early days. But right now we believe that we're on track to produce 1 truckload of sludge every 5 years, as opposed to 1, every week. So that's 1/250th, if you will, 1/260th the amount of sludge. But what's really critical from a financial point of view for you to understand is that the incremental investment here was about $600,000 more than a conventional one, and that paid for itself in about 16 months. So basically, this thing's making me money now. So it's a classic example of taking a totally ecological approach, shattering the old myth, reusing the waste, driving down my labor costs, driving down my energy costs, and so forth. We've taken that same notion to heart with our packaging. As I've already mentioned, the key with packaging is really light weighting. Only 5%, it doesn't matter which resin your local town accepts, only about 5% of plastics in circulation ever get back and get recycled. And again, the carbon foot, I don't mean to dismiss recycling, it's critical. I hauled my bin out at 6 this morning at our house to our curbside, but nevertheless, we have to understand that it's a band-aid to the bigger problem. The bigger issue is light weighting. And so we have saved massive amounts of money by light weighting. Now we've gone to the next level, which is these 4-packs and 6-packs that you see here are now literally made from plants. As of May as of a year ago, it's not our ideal solution. It's corn, and corn is ultimately not where we want to go, but it's a step on the way. We believe within a year we're going to be out of corn. We're going to be onto either switchgrass or agricultural waste. The ultimate goal is that we can actually make this from methane from wastewater plants. So I'll be able to take the methane from the Brunswick wastewater treatment plant, capture it in solid form, and turn it into a plastic. Ultimately, what this did for us in the short run, the reason, even though corn is not our ideal, the reason we still leapt at it, is this was a 48% reduction in our footprint from our packaging. And by the way, it was a 48% reduction not just because we're not using oil anymore, but also because this stuff is so strong. In fact, this was the biggest problem we had with this conversion. The plastic is so strong that when you mold it and then you cut it into 4-packs or 6-packs, it actually was dulling the knives that we use. So we actually had to get sharper knives for this system. But the point is that this is the way all packaging is going to be. And you'll be able to, in our lifetimes, we will probably have an edible cup, but at the very least, we're going to have a compostable cup. This is industrially compostable because it's all plant-based. It's not really compostable in your backyard. You need high heat conditions and a lot of air. But the next generation with switchgrass will be. It'll be something you can put in your backyard, and it will be gone, literally gone in 28 days from when you threw it out there. So I won't belabor the point. I just want to give one other truly fantastic example that really drives home the point. It's interesting. I gave a speech to the National Association of Food Shippers about this. These are people who truck and train and ship food all over the world, and I explained what I'm about to explain to you, and one of the skeptics was flying home, and what I was and he wrote me afterwards that he's no longer skeptical because he happened to fly over southern Florida at a moment where they were having a sugarcane harvest. And the reason he knew it was a sugarcane harvest is they were burning all the fields, because traditionally that's what we do. And again, in our limited way of thinking about our relationship to the planet, there's obviously a lot of you're looking at 40,000 acres of organic sugarcane here. But there's a lot of photosynthesis that goes on to concentrate the sun's rays into carbohydrates. So to make those stalks of cane, you have a lot of leafy matter, which is considered to be a waste product. So typically we'll go in and we'll burn the field so you can get rid of all that waste matter. Of course, that's releasing carbon into the atmosphere, but it's also even doubly dangerous because you're taking any nutrients that were built up in the topsoil under these plants, and you're burning that and sending that into the atmosphere as well, which means that you now have to replace that fertility with chemical fertility from Kuwait or Iraq or Iran or somewhere. And so my ecologist colleagues in Brazil said, we're not going to, this is crazy, it's just driving up our costs every year to replace that fertility with chemical fertilizers. So in 97, with our support, they converted 3,000 acres over to organic. And today it's now about 40,000 acres. And what's going on here, and this is just, I'll illustrate it here. This is the actual sugarcane harvest. You can see the sugarcane going into the trucks. This is the leafy matter that's being spread. This is just me grabbing a clump of it. And literally, the topsoil underlying these sugarcane crops are never exposed to the erosive effects of wind or water erosion, not even for 1 second, because it's literally, you're getting about a meter thick of duff built up. And the net result is, of course, tremendous biodiversity. I'll show you that in a second. But just to underscore, this entire system is organic. The truck tires underlying this thing and this rig over here are low PSI tires because they don't want to compact the soils. So you could literally drive over your foot and not injure you with this system. Well, here's the net result of the system. They've had a 90% reduction in pest damage since they were non-organic. Okay, this is all formerly non-organic fields. They've improved. They have 312 species that have now returned to these fields. And by the way, the last time I was at Bowdoin giving this talk a couple of years ago, that number was 180. They've cataloged another 132 species, and so the number's on the rise. In other words, the whole food chain is very healthy. They've improved the groundwater quality and volume. The carbon content underlying these fields is now equal or better than the native forests, depending on the pocket that were there. So it takes 100 years to build an inch of topsoil in New England through nature, but we're building topsoil by the inch, by the decade. I mean, multiple inches per decade. But here's the punchline, is that they've had a 10% increase in yields. They're getting higher yields than they were when it was non-organic, with lower inputs, lower cost inputs, because they're now less dependent on fossil fuels. So the net result here is organic sugar used to cost me 100% more than conventional sugar back when we started. Now it's actually, at this moment right now, organic sugar costs less than conventional sugar. And by the way, we're seeing this across the board. We have Stonyfield buys over 200 commodities, and in all cases the costs are coming down for all these commodities with more and more volume. And that's because on the conventional side, the chemical side, the input costs are going up because they're all fossil fuel based. When you cross the $100 a barrel oil, the ramifications that ripple through all of agriculture are enormous. So this is absolutely an effective example. This is the one of the reservoirs on the 40,000 acres. There's no organophosphates in this water. You can't find these chemical compounds. This is Brazil, so there's a lot of other things that will kill you in this water, but it isn't going to be toxins, anyways. I'm watching the clock, and I don't want to go too much longer, so I'm going to go quickly on this example, but in the Q&A I'm happy to go into it more if you want. But as I mentioned earlier, milk is the biggest part of our footprint, so we really focus on the farms. We're concentrating bringing the same anaerobic digesters that we use at Stonyfield to the farms. This helps the farms in numerous ways. We're working very hard to reduce the methane output from the cows. It's really, despite the cartoons, it's actually not the back end. It's actually the burping of cows, which is where the real contribution is. And frankly, when you look at how most of our beef and dairy is grown in America on these confined animal feedlots, where there's literally there's nothing natural happening there at all. These are basically giant methane generation systems, not just because the cows are eating only corn, which is a big part of the problem. Corn, they're herbivores, not carnivores, so they burp a lot of methane. Methane is 24 times more impactful as a global warming gas than CO2, but also because they're unhealthy. Because omega-3s, which are critical to life, we all need them. I hope you're all taking your fish oil. Are you taking it? There's no omega-3s in the feedlot. I mean, because there's nothing natural. There's no grasses there at all. And so that makes the cows sicker, and as the cows get sicker, then they're actually producing even more methane. So we launched a project that, again, I'll just cover very quickly, to actually convert over our cows from corn. 25 to 30% of their feed regimen has now gone over to high omega-3 fatty acid. First of all, none of our cows, of course, are in feedlots. It's all grass-based and access to pasture or hay. But by switching over to flax as a high omega-3 fatty acid, we've been able to reduce the burping substantially, and we've also improved the animal's health and the healthfulness of our milk. So when you're eating our yogurt, you're actually getting higher omega-3s than you would through others. Interestingly, organic cows live twice as long as conventional cows. Most people don't realize that. And we're now getting, the vets are telling us from this program, we're getting 25 to 30% increases in longevity even over that by just focusing on better feeding regimens. So, of course, the cows love it, and the farmers do too. Again, organics is a perfect example of that fourth stage thinking. Because organics is all about building topsoil, eliminating toxicity, getting rid of those externalities. And on top of it, traditionally, if you're a non-organic dairy farmer in Maine, by the way, right now, organics is 16% of Maine's dairy. That's the good news. The bad news is the denominator, because obviously there's less and less dairy farms out there. And this is why, if you're a conventional dairy farmer, this is what you've been paid per 100 pounds of milk going back to the early 90s. It's been a roller coaster ride. Versus this is what we pay for organic milk, 60+% more than you would get. So so when you're buying organic products, you're helping the local. You're really driving the profitability or the viability, survivability of family farmers, who of course are trapping their nutrients on the farm, because the goal with organics is to build the topsoil. So this is a study that was done comparing farms in Maine and Vermont, looking at the profitability of organic versus conventional. Again, it's not only ecologically correct, it's more, you make more money, some close to 80% more per hundredweight. And now that we're starting to understand that the animals live twice as long, in fact, the economics are even more favorable for organic over conventional. So when you get these, ridiculous arguments that organic is a, kind of a nice idea, but it's really not proven, I would say to you, it's the chemicals that are not proven. I would say to you that, in the 60, 70-year experiment we've been on with chemicals in agriculture, the data is coming in, and it is not good. If you think about it, every famous person in history ate only organic food, right? George Washington ate only organic food. Mozart, Joan of Arc, they did fine, right? Mozart didn't live so long, but he was very productive during his short life. But really, we have this idea that organic is some new thing. It's the chemicals that are new. And we've been on this experiment, and it isn't working. And we know it, and we see it in all kinds of results. So when you look at a Stonyfield, not only are you getting these incredible ecological and economic results, but you can see the kind of what it means in terms of real chemical avoidance. And obviously it's not, Stonyfield alone isn't going to do this. We need to convert the Dannons and the Yoplais and everybody else who's out there. But certainly, this is what I call win-win-win-win-win economics. Everybody, everything is winning with this approach. Let's not forget that so too are we the consumers. This is a very kind of a frightening study. 3 to 6-year-olds were analyzed at the University of Washington on just regular conventional diets, non-organic diets. This is the the units of organophosphates that were found in the kids' urine. This is 3 to 6-year-olds just eating regular food, fairly high numbers. And then you get the same kids switched over to organic diets for a week, and look what happened. Our body has the ability to purge this stuff pretty quickly. The relative units drop right off, and then when they switched back, came right back up again. And so again, we can't say that the presence of these chemicals in our blood or our urine or our bodies is necessarily, a cause. There's no cause and effect case that anybody can make, but it can't be good for us. And as we now know, if you're a breast cancer victim, it has very little to do with genetics. Something like 7% of breast cancer causes are genetically derived. It has everything to do with what you were eating and how you were living when you were 10, 11, 12, 13 at the time of breast development. And so this need to focus on children is great. And at the very least, we know that on organic diets there's a lot less of these compounds present. Okay, I want to race through one final piece of this, and then this argument, and then let's have some questions if you'd like.